They don't seem to understand that the entire world sees what's happening and finds it horrific and detestable and despicable and has turned against Israel. The entire world, including in public opinion in most Western countries. Public opinion in this country months ago opposed the Biden administration's policy. Public opinion months ago in the United States opposed Israel's war. And public opinion opposed sending weapons, majorities, to Israel. That's American public opinion, which has been subjected to decades of an exclusively Israeli narrative. And they've already seen through the fog of propaganda and lies and the anguish that was caused by the 7th of October in Israel and among many people in the United States, they've suddenly seen what's happened since is really bad and should not continue.
I just learned in the 100 Years' War on Palestine that your family has a very distinguished history in Palestine. I thought that might be a good place to start. So who were some of the members of your family, and how far back does it all go?
Well, I mean, there's a tested history for our family in Jerusalem going back to the time of the Crusades.
Okay.
Possibly earlier, but certainly the time of the Crusades or just after. And some of the people who figure in the book are these 19th century figures one of whom was a member of the first Ottoman Parliament, mayor of Jerusalem, ends up writing a letter to Theodor Herzl. Another one, his nephew, was also a deputy of Jerusalem in the 1908 Parliament, and also played a role in the Arab reaction to Zionism. So, I mean, they're members of my family who play all kinds of roles in Jerusalem, in law, in education, and in politics. I had an uncle who was the last elected Arab mayor of Jerusalem. I mention him also in the book.
Yeah, I was wondering in particular about this correspondence between the great-great-uncle, great-great-great-uncle. How many greats?
What's a great between friends?
Yeah, and Theodor Herzl on the eve of the Zionist revolution.
Right. Yeah, he writes to him in 1899, 2 years after the first Zionist Congress in Basel. And he has lived in Austria. You know, Herzl was a Viennese journalist and published in German. His famous book, Der Judenstaat, the State of the Jews, is published in German. And it's clear that Yosef Khalidi, who's the person we're talking about, this great-great-great-uncle, had read about the Congress, had read about Zionism. He may well have read the book. We don't know. But he knew a great deal about Zionism. And so he writes to Herzl, and he tells him that, he tells him a variety of things. First of all, he says that we understand the connection between the Jewish people and the Holy Land. We understand the persecution you're subject to in Europe. We understand where Zionism is coming from. So he understands that it's a national project. He understands that it's a reaction to persecution. But he says you're not taking into account the fact that Palestine is already inhabited by a people that's going to resist being displaced. And at the end, he says, for the sake of God, leave Palestine alone. And so this is probably the first recorded, anyway, response by a Palestinian to the very beginnings of Zionism in 1899, so a couple of years after the first Zionist Congress.
And before we speak about October 7th and then the year since, I'd like to get a better sense of your understanding of this very broad context that extends very far back in time. But I'm particularly curious about the last 100 years. And am I right that you view October 7th as just one instance of this very long and protracted war?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that it is completely incomprehensible, or rather its meaning is totally distorted if we assume that history started on October 7th, 2023.
Which is how it is for a lot of people who haven't been following this. I mean, myself included, I'm not somebody who has spent as much time as they should learning about the world. And so this really put things on the map for me.
Right. Well, for people who have been paying attention, or for people who know the history, at least in my view, this fits into the narrative that I lay out in the book. This is a struggle over Palestine, in which the Palestinians have been subject to what I call a war on Palestine, which is waged not just by the Zionist movement, but more importantly by the great powers. In other words, the people who actually fight the Palestinians in the 20s and the 30s are the British on behalf of the Zionist project. I see the United States and other powers as playing the same kind of role, right up to this present moment when the New York Times tells us American intelligence and military personnel are helping to track down Hamas leaders, helping to track down and kill Hezbollah leaders. So it is not just a project supported by the United States or where the United States lends the occasional, diplomatic help to Israel. It's much, much more than that. It's not just the bombs and the planes and the helicopters. Also, it is an American-Israeli war, is how I see it. Certainly for the last several decades. And it has always been one which involved the great powers of the age on the side of the Zionist project and later on the side of the State of Israel against the Palestinians. And most of the Western countries are aligned, as I argue in the book, with the United States and Israel.
And what do you mark as the beginning of this 100 Years' War?
Well, I started in 1917 because obviously before that you have Zionism. Zionist movement as a political project starts in 1897. So that's 20 years before 1917. I have a book on Palestinian identity where I talk about the pre-World War I period as the sort of cradle of a sense of Palestinian identity. So both of these things go back before 1917. But what we see today takes on the configuration that it's had ever since in 1917, when Britain lends the support of the greatest empire on earth to the Zionist project with the Balfour Declaration, where the British government says that it looks with favor on the establishment in Palestine of a Jewish national home, and where they don't mention the Palestinians, they don't mention their national or political rights. And they say, on the one hand, you have a Jewish people with a right to a national existence, and on the other hand, you have others, a non-Jewish population, which has civil and religious rights, not national rights, not political. That's a declaration of war, as I read it. And that's the beginning of what we have seen ever since. It's not just a bunch of people trying to establish a Jewish homeland. It's a bunch of people doing that in association with great powers, whether it's Britain initially or later on, Britain and France, or the United States and the Soviet Union, or most recently, obviously, the United States.
It's interesting. We saw Norman Finkelstein on our way out, and in our conversation that just ended a little while ago, I asked him a similar question about how far he thought we needed to go back to understand October 7th. And I had thought that he was going to say biblical times, because these are times that are often cited in discussions of this. But he said the Nakba. I find it interesting that you didn't choose the Old Testament times the way that I might have, but you also didn't choose the Nakba.
Right.
How do those two periods fit into this for you?
I mean, I see the Nakba as a phase, and a really important phase. This being, of course, the dispossession and expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians in 1948, at the same time as the State of Israel is established. Actually, before and during the establishment of the State of Israel, hundreds of thousands of people are driven from their homes before the state is established by Zionist militias, and then the rest are driven out during the war between Israel and the Arab countries that intervene. So that's the Nakba. And I see it as extremely important, but I see it as not just emerging from the establishment of Israel, but as emerging from a decision by the United States and the Soviet Union to create a Jewish state in support of this project, which goes back, a ways. This is part of the theme that I'm arguing in the book, that just as the British launched this as the project that we see today, Zionism antecedes it, of course. The United States and the Soviet Union, as it were, take it over in 1947 by pushing the partition resolution through the UN General Assembly. The biblical thing is, in my view, an entire red herring.
Interesting.
There's a biblical element to the connection of Judaism and the Jewish people to the Holy Land, obviously. That goes without saying. But the project for a Jewish national home is not a project that is carried for 2,000 years by Jews. In fact, it's something that the entire rabbinical establishment opposes. The return of the Jews is something that is to happen in God's time. It's not supposed to be an act of man. And for most of the period up to the rise of the Nazis, Zionism is a tiny minority among Jewish communities in Europe and the United States. It really doesn't get majority support until suddenly Hitler comes along and everything changes. In the United States, it's not until the 1940s that major Jewish institutions adopt the project as they have done ever since. And the same is true in Europe. Many, many major figures in Jewish communities, the only Jewish cabinet member in the British cabinet that adopts the Balfour Declaration, are opposed to Zionism. They feel it will harm their status within the countries in which they live. It will incite accusations of dual loyalty. They think it's impractical, whatever. So I think the biblical thing is entirely a red herring, because it's true that it tells us about a connection. It doesn't tell us about the project to establish a modern national home in the 19th and 20th century, which is a late 19th century idea. Before Herzl, you have a few thinkers going back to the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. You have settlers who arrive in the 1870s and late 1870s and 1880s, but you do not have a national project, or the idea for a national home doesn't exist. In fact, the first Zionists are Christian Zionists, people like Lord Shaftesbury in England in the 1840s and 50s.
I had not realized this.
Yes. Long before you have political Zionism and writers who are saying, our connection to the Holy Land is not just religious. It should be as a modern people in a modern national context. That's a late 19th century idea among Jewish thinkers. It's an early 19th century idea among British evangelical Christians. And Lord Shaftesbury is important. He's the father-in-law of the British Prime Minister. He's one of the founders of the Palestine Exploration Fund. He has an enormous role, among many other leading British figures, in what we call Christian Zionism to this day. It actually it precedes the modern political Zionism. So the Bible is important. It's important in terms of how Christian evangelicals understand this. They see it as going right back to the Bible. And today, many Israeli nationalists, many especially right-wing religious nationalists, see a seamless connection between the Bible and the 21st century. I don't think historically there's any justification for that, actually.
One thing that you said just a few minutes ago that I found quite fascinating, and I might butcher this a little bit, but I think I'll get the spirit right. You said that this war over the last 100 years, it hasn't just been fought with guns, bombs, and helicopters. And given the news over the past year, we kind of equate war with the guns, the bombs,
Right,
and the helicopters, and now the drones. And what this leads me to wonder is, what are some of the other very important ways that people might be overlooking in which this war has been fought over the last 100 years that didn't involve full-on violence?
Before there was full-on violence, or when full-on violence was at a very limited level, you had what I would call a discursive war, a war of narratives, a propaganda war, you can call it, where people like Herzl are proselytizing this idea and are doing so successfully. His successor, Chaim Weizmann, their successors, people like Zev Jabotinsky, people like David Ben-Gurion, are both building up the Zionist project in Palestine and outside, building up its financial wherewithal, settling, purchasing land, involved in diplomacy and so forth. But they're also trying to establish a narrative in the West. And that has been a battlefield since the very beginning, one on which actually there was only one army or one actor, which was the Zionist movement, and later the State of Israel. I mean, on the other side, you had Palestinians who had almost no real access to or understanding of the kind of Western audiences that the Zionists were extremely effective in speaking to, because they were Westerners themselves. Chaim Weizmann is central to the British war effort. Herzl is an Austrian. Abba Eban is a South African. Golda Meir is an American. I mean, they emigrate to Israel, they become Israelis, but they speak English to English people, or German to German people, or whatever language we're talking about, as natives, as people who are part of the political culture of these societies and can speak convincingly in a way that no Arab spokesperson for generations matches. And we're talking right up to, I would say, the end of the 20th, beginning of the 21st century, whereas you're talking about the 1890s, the first decades of the 20th century, where there's an effective and quite, I think, well thought out argument for Zionism being made. And that's what wins over politicians and public opinion over many decades. And it culminates, obviously, with the Holocaust. Zionism argues you cannot live safely as a Jewish community or as Jews outside of the ancestral homeland, what's called the ancestral homeland. And that argument doesn't convince many people. Most people either emigrate to the United States if they're unhappy, or they try and change the societies they're in, Germany, Britain, France, especially Russia. You don't have huge immigration to Palestine. You have tens of thousands, a few thousand, before Hitler comes to power. Hitler comes to power, everything changes. Suddenly, people are convinced by the Zionist argument in ways that they were not before that.
I find this idea of a discursive war quite intriguing. Do you view this discursive war as continuing today up to this point in tandem with the military war?
Of course. One reason that the military war is so successful, one reason that we send F-35s and F-15s and F-16s and artillery ammunition and 2,000-pound bombs and so on and so forth, is because the Israeli narrative is central to the way the media and politicians see the world. I read the New York Times, and I see a newspaper which is essentially seeing absolutely everything from an Israeli perspective. I mean, there are articles from Beirut, there are articles from elsewhere, but they're the way in which they see the world. This is true of, I would argue, mainstream TV stations. It's true of the entirety of the mainstream media, is from an Israeli perspective. How does this affect Israel? Today, Bret Stephens has a piece. We should do this. He's talking about we and Israel. It's like one. And I think that is a result of discursive victories over generations, such that among our politicians, almost without exception, among the mainstream corporate media, almost without exception, that perspective has become central. It's less effective with younger people because they don't pay attention to the mainstream corporate media. They see the world through different glasses, as it were.
That's an interesting way of explaining how the different generations view this conflict with completely different lenses.
Right. Well, that's new. I mean, I would argue that until the 70s, 80s, 90s, it was very, very rare for anything but an Israeli perspective to break into the mainstream media. And so you had a few dissidents, you had a few people who didn't see things that way, but they were a tiny minority. You never would see anybody in Congress opening their mouths, and if they did, they would lose the next election. Pete McCloskey, I could go through the half dozen members of Congress William Fulbright, who expressed some objections to this absolute adherence to the Israeli narrative, and were immediately, or very quickly, lost their seats. Today, you have dozens of members of Congress, a number of senators, several dozen members of the House of Representatives, who have expressed critical views on this. And that's a function of their listening to their constituents rather than listening to the din of the sort of Israeli perspective out of the mainstream media and out of most of the rest of our elites, to be very frank, in Western societies.
Another word you used that stuck out at me is propaganda. The reason that this word jumps out at me is that I've had a number of conversations about Israel and Palestine on the show, talking with a wide variety of people on different sides of the issue. The only other person that I recall who used that word is Benny Morris when I spoke with him. And Benny Morris in that conversation labeled Norman Finkelstein and I think some other people pro-Palestine as propagandists. And I'm not here trying to incite you into an invective about Benny Morris, but what I'm wondering is if you think that there are legitimate defenses from people who are historically informed and academic for Israel's side of things, or is it largely propaganda on your view?
I think that things have changed a lot. I think that a lot of what passed for scholarship in times past, in half a century ago, immediately after the creation of Israel, and the decades before, much of it really was absolutely meritless. It really only reflected one perspective, and it didn't reflect it entirely accurately, in my view. That's to say most of what was published academically. I'm talking about supposedly reputable historians and social scientists and so on. And that has really changed in the last several decades, such that most of what is being written now is much more balanced, much more fair, much more historically accurate. And I'm a historian, so I'm particularly interested in history. But this is true across disciplines. It's true in anthropology. It's true in political science. It's true in sociology. It's true in literature. And so most of what's being produced today, including by many Israeli academics, in my view, is pretty sound work. There are biases. Everybody has a perspective. Everybody has a point of view. This idea that there's some, ideal Platonic objectivity is absolute nonsense. Everybody's coming from a specific point of view, and everybody's affected by what happens around them. But with that understanding, I would say that the scholarship has become infinitely better. Many of the lies that were peddled, their leaders told them to leave. Well, that actually wasn't ever true. And it was believed and, spread constantly in the literature of the late 1940s and 50s. Never was true. Blown apart in the 50s, and only when Israeli historians confirmed that, among them Benny Morris, in his first book, Creation of the Palestine Refugee Problem, did suddenly people realize, well, actually, we've been peddling a lie all of these decades. And that's true for many other similar myths. So, I don't want to speak to specific things that Benny Morris said. But when I talk about propaganda, I'm really talking about what you get mainly in the mainstream media and what politicians spout, most of which is completely detached, I'm sorry, from reality.
No, I am perfectly well aware of this. Earlier this morning, I did an interview about the upcoming election, and in preparation for that, I looked at Trump and Harris's agendas as posted on their websites, and a lot was absolutely detached from reality. So I can echo and amplify a little bit. But I think this context has been very helpful. This conversation, as I envision it, is to be about October 7th and a year in review. And that means putting Gaza in focus. The Nakba has already come up. But for our listeners who are not maybe entirely familiar with the events, and more particularly not familiar with how they helped create the Gaza that we know today, could you briefly describe what happened in the Nakba and its relationship to Gaza?
Sure. Well, there are a number of myths. One of them is that 7 Arab armies attacked Israel, and the leaders of the Palestinians told them to run away, and they ran away expecting that these Arab armies would overwhelm Israel. And so the Arabs started it, and these people left of their own volition, and Israel bears no responsibility whatsoever for the outcome, which is 750,000 people, majority of the Palestinian population at the time, who left their homes. A whole bunch of things are missing from this. First of all, there were not 7 Arab armies in 1948. Saudi Arabia did not have a modern army. Yemen did not have a modern army. The Lebanese army never crosses the frontier. There were 4 Arab armies. Secondly, almost a half of the people who are driven from their homes are driven from their homes in cities like Jaffa, Haifa, Pisan, Tiberias, before May 15th, 1948, when the State of Israel is established, before the end of the Mandate, when the British nominally leave, and before the Arab armies enter. They're driven out as a result of offensives that take place in the spring of 1948, in which, as I've said, all of the Arab neighborhoods of all of these cities are emptied of their population, and dozens of villages are ethnically cleansed. And this is part of a process whereby you turn a majority Arab country into a majority Jewish state. You couldn't have done it otherwise. 2/3 of the population of Palestine in 1948 is Arab. How do you create a Jewish state in a majority Arab country? Even within the boundaries of the 1947 UN partition, almost half the population is Arab. It wouldn't have been a Jewish state. It would have been an Arab Jewish state unless those people were forced to leave. And they were forced to leave by massacres, by being put on trucks. I mean, we have in Israeli literature stories, Khir Bet Khiza, which is a famous early work of fiction by a man named Smolansky. He calls himself S. Yizhar, that's his pseudonym. He writes about what he and the unit that he was part of, I mean, it's basing it on his personal experience, did in a specific village. So the Nakba was the ethnic cleansing of the areas that become Israel before and during the Arab-Israeli War, when the Arab states come in. Now, why do the Arab states come in? They come in to destroy Israel? Well, they come in reluctantly, not having wanted to do this, because they have floods of refugees arriving in Amman, arriving in Beirut, arriving in Damascus, and driving governments that have, just recently achieved independence, that have shaky and weak militaries into a war that, they probably didn't want to fight. And there's evidence for this. There's now, people have looked at the Egyptian archives, people have looked at the Iraqi archives, and the military is telling the politicians, we don't have the wherewithal to fight a war here. And in fact, we now know the Israeli army, as it developed immediately after the state is established, actually was slightly stronger than the 3 or 4 Arab armies that it was fighting. So it was a pitched battle. It was a struggle for existence on the part of the Israelis, certainly. And Israel suffered the highest number of casualties in any Arab-Israeli war in the 1948 war. So it was a desperate struggle. But they actually had superiority in the field in terms of numbers, in terms of weapons. They were getting weapons from the Soviet Union via Czechoslovakia. They were getting weapons from the United States. So the Nakba is the expulsion of these people. In the southern parts of Palestine, they're driven southwards, and they end up in what we call the Gaza Strip, which is the area where the Egyptian army ended up. And they live under Egyptian military administration from 1948 or 1949 armistice until 1967, when Gaza is occupied by Israel, with a brief period in 56, 57 when Israel occupies Gaza and then is forced to leave.
And the people who live in Gaza today, what relationship do they bear to the people who lived there at the time of the Nakba?
Well, there's a population in Gaza. There's a city of Gaza. There's a city of Rafah. There's a town of Khan Yunis. There's a population of that region. But the overwhelming majority of the population today are descendants of refugees who are driven from the southern parts of Palestine and flee behind the Egyptian lines and end up inside the armistice lines in the Gaza Strip, where, by the way, they're kept by the Egyptians. Egypt doesn't let them move into Egypt and doesn't give them Egyptian citizenship. They have passports saying Egyptian passports, refugee passports, but they're not Egyptian citizens and they're not allowed into Egypt.
One thing that's quite unique about this conversation for me is that I'm having it with someone who has been very deeply personally affected by this conflict. And what I'm wondering is, I saw this in your book, just how was your own family affected by the Nakba?
Well, my grandfather and much of the family lived in an area called Tel Rish, which is a suburb of Jaffa, what is now Tel Aviv-Yafo. And they were forced to leave their home. And they ended up, moving among their children, Nablus, Beirut, wherever their kids ended up. All of the rest of the family had to leave. Some of them were living in Jerusalem, didn't have to leave. But the family was completely disrupted. My parents had been in Palestine in 1947, were planning to go back after my father finished his studies here. They could never go back. So I was born in New York as a consequence of it. So I personally didn't suffer. I wasn't even born when these things happened. But I was born here because of the Nakba. And so the whole family was affected, each one in different ways. One of my uncles ended up in Alexandria. Others ended up in Beirut, and so on. Amman, Jerusalem, Ramallah, Nablus. The family was scattered as a result of this. They were lucky. I mean, some of them lost their property. Some of them, my grandfather, and some of them lost their home near Jaffa. But they survived, at least.
Well, it's 100 years war. We're slowly inching toward the present, and starting from the Nakba, I'm wondering how Gaza became what it is today, where now we see, these crumbling concrete cities. What was it like when people moved there?
Right.
How is it that it ended up becoming described by many people as a concentration camp?
Yeah, I wouldn't use that term, but
You
anyway,
wouldn't? Okay.
Yeah, people have. Concentration camps were places where people were shifted to death camps.
Right. This is. I'm saying this now because Norman and I were speaking about it. He quoted many people who have referred to it in that way.
People have used the term. I wouldn't. Doesn't matter. Well, first of all, the overwhelming majority of the population are refugees. And so for most of the period thereafter, they live in refugee camps established by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA. Many of them move out of the camps into Gaza City. So Gaza becomes a huge city by the 21st century, in which more than half the population are people who had moved out of the refugee camps and into the city. And that's true in Rafah and Khan Yunis and other parts of the Gaza Strip. And its situation changes with the occupation of 1967. First of all, there's an attempt to move as many of these people out, get rid of them, move them to Egypt. Israel forces a lot of them out of the Gaza Strip and tries to get others to leave. It's doing this all over the West Bank and East Jerusalem. About 350,000 Palestinians are forced to leave, driven out of refugee camps in the Jordan River Valley, driven out of Jerusalem, driven out of villages along the road to Jerusalem, right after the 67 war, about 300,000 people. So 750,000 in 1948, 49, and another 300,000 in 1967. And they live under Israeli military occupation. I mean, one of the greatest lies in American political discourse is Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Israel is a country which for 57 years has ruled through a jackboot military occupation over a population almost as large as the Jewish population of Israel. How can it be a democracy where within the same sovereign space, almost 50% of the population have no rights whatsoever? They don't go before real courts, they go before military courts, which don't dispense justice. They dispense basically what the occupation wants them to dispense, where everything they do in terms of entry, exit, import, export, movement is regulated by a foreign army. And that's 3 generations that this has gone on. And the most severe of these restrictions are imposed on Gaza for a variety of reasons. For one thing, Gaza is the place where there's the highest concentration of refugees. Moshe Dayan gives a famous speech in the 50s where he talks about, you can understand why these people are fighting us, because we've taken their homes, and they look across the armistice lines and they see their homes. And so you're talking about a population that comes from what are today the southern regions of Israel, and who are prevented by Israel from ever returning or from getting their homes and property back. So Gaza becomes sort of the cradle of resistance. After the 67 war, the military commander in that region is Ariel Sharon, and he carries out a ruthless campaign in the early 70s, demolishing homes, hunting down people who are resisting the occupation. And I insist on using the term resisting the occupation because this is a foreign military occupation. What would you call it? Are the people who resisted Napoleon Bonaparte's invasion of Spain terrorists because they were fighting the French army? No. Would you call French partisans who fought, Russian partisans who fought German occupation terrorists? No, you'd call them people resisting an occupation. And that's what people in Gaza were doing. And it was always the area in which, political movements that became important in Palestinian politics first developed. So Fatah first develops there. Hamas first develops there in the Gaza Strip.
Hamas is how I usually pronounce it, and it's just funny that I was mirroring your pronunciation. But I wanted to ask more about Hamas because it is described in many different ways by many different people. So I want to get your take on Hamas and also a better understanding of how Hamas, in some ways, maybe it wasn't Hamas's doing, but Hamas's very existence contributed to the blockade that was imposed on Gaza.
Right. Well, the blockade goes back to 1993. The siege of Gaza does not start with Hamas. Hamas is established in 1987, and it's engaged in various kinds of resistance. This is the period of the First Intifada. Most of the First Intifada's resistance is things like boycotts, strikes, demonstrations, rock throwing. So there's some violence, but it's essentially a popular uprising. And Hamas is involved in this and is also carrying out military activities. But the actual siege of Gaza, which becomes more and more tight as time goes on, starts with the Oslo Accords. The walls and the fences and the checkpoints, and in particular the encirclement and siege of Gaza starts with a so-called peace process, whereby Israel closes off the occupied territories as part of what's called separation, and immiserates the Palestinian population in consequence. People used to go across and work. You could move freely all across the occupied territories before 1993, before Oslo. You could rent a car in the West Bank and drive to the Golan Heights. You could drive to Eilat. You could drive to Gaza with almost no hindrance. The sealing off of the Gaza Strip and of parts of the West Bank begins with the Oslo process, with this so-called peace process. And it becomes more and more intense, and that in turn generates resistance. So Hamas objects to what the PLO has decided on in the 1980s, which is to, first of all, renounce violence, secondly, recognize Israel, thirdly, accept the partition of Palestine, and fourthly, try and negotiate. So in 1988, all of this is consecrated at the Palestine National Congress. Hamas is established in 1987 to oppose this trend, to say, no, we want to liberate all of Palestine. We don't just want a mini Palestinian state in 22% of historic Palestine. We want the whole of Palestine. We want to do what the PLO originally said it was going to do, and what it is now renounced. So Hamas represents resistance to the shift that's taken place in Palestinian politics, and which is overwhelmingly popular among Palestinians. To explain why it does what it does, you have to understand the failure of the process that the Palestinians enter into at Oslo. I mean, I was involved in negotiations from Madrid in October of 1991 as an advisor to the Palestinian delegation until the summer of 1993. And what we realized is that this is not a process that's intended to lead to independence, sovereignty, self-determination, and statehood. This is a process that's intended to prolong and maintain occupation, to prolong and maintain and expand Israeli settlements, and to get the Palestinians to accept this.
And that's the goal, to get the Palestinians to accept this?
Essentially, yes, to get them to accept less than a state. And in fact, those are the words that Prime Minister Rabin uses in his last speech before the Israeli Knesset, just before he is assassinated in 1995. He says, what we're offering the Palestinians is less than a state, and we will control the Jordan River Valley. What does that mean? That means the occupation continues. Israel will control entry, exit, import, export. It's a Bantustan. So it's a one state, one Bantustan solution rather than a two state. And this is what the United States goes along with. This is not just some rogue Israeli plan. And that's really all that the most forthcoming Israeli leaders, people like Rabin, people like Barak, people like Ehud Olmert, were ever willing to offer. And in view of that, Hamas gets stronger and stronger. If they're not going to give us the state that you made all these concessions for, why should we not resist? Why should we not use violence? And frankly, the expansion of settlements, which continues, the tightening of the occupation, which proceeds all through the 1990s, strengthens Hamas. And they carry out attacks, they carry out suicide bombings that derail the process. But this is not just caused by Hamas. This is caused by the complete failure of this process to lead to what the only thing that the Palestinians would have accepted, which is full sovereign statehood, and which I've concluded from my own participation and what I've watched since then was never really on offer. It might have been if the Palestinians had been stronger or shrewder, but it wasn't.
But why does the election of Hamas trigger this blockade? What is the sequence of events?
I've argued that you already had a siege before this. I've argued this goes back to the 1990s. The encirclement and the sealing off of Gaza, the establishment of checkpoints, Erez, and all of that is from the late 90s. The elections, 2006. So we've had 8 or 9 years of this going on. More than 8 or 9 years. What am I talking about? Over 10 years of this going on before Hamas is elected it gets a majority in parliament in 2006. It doesn't win a majority of votes, by the way. It wins about 44% of the votes. But Fatah has split, and so they get a majority of the seats. Sort of like a British parliamentary election, where a party that gets 38% gets overwhelming majorities in parliament because of a first-past-the-post system. So they win the election. And that triggers even further restrictions on Gaza.
So did the further restrictions imposed in 2007 really exacerbate the destitution of the area?
It did, ironically, thanks to smuggling tunnels. Ironically, thanks to a policy that was decided upon by a variety of Israeli governments, which in fact reinforced the Hamas government in Gaza by allowing Qatari and other money to come in. The situation was slightly ameliorated in some ways. I mean, you still had restrictions on food. You still had restrictions on imports. You still had Israeli controls. You still had periodic Israeli attacks on Gaza in response to rocket fire or other actions, or sometimes just to what the Israeli military used to call mowing the grass. We're just going to attack them and keep them down. So on the one hand, Israel was under the Netanyahu governments and other governments facilitating the separation between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, trying to weaken the Palestinian Authority that had been established in the West Bank, and strengthening, in fact, the Hamas government in Gaza.
Well, I think that given just how high profile October 7th has been, we don't need to spend that much time today talking about exactly what happened on October 7th, but a lot has happened since, and there are lots of debates about what has happened since. One of the big ones, even though for some people it's a very much an open and closed issue, is whether or not genocide has been and is being committed.
Right.
And so some of the guests that I've spoken to on the podcast do not think that genocide is being committed, and they think it's appalling to suggest that it is. So I'm wondering how you evaluate the claim of genocide.
Well, I mean, it's a legal term. I'm not a lawyer. I think you can look at what's happened. Several things have happened. Firstly, Israel tried to push the population out of the Gaza Strip, and it got Tony Blinken to run around as its errand boy to Egypt, to Jordan, and Saudi Arabia in the first weeks of the war to get them to accept people that Israel would drive out of the Gaza Strip. These governments refused, but that was the intention. So expelling population might or might not fall into the definition of genocide, but all are part of the, if I remember the language of the Genocide Convention, it talks about doing certain things to all or part of a population. Second thing that happened was that Israel declared that it would cut off food, water, electricity, fuel, medical supplies, anything to the Gaza Strip, which meant that they were, in effect, threatening to and ended up doing something that led to almost starvation situation. The third thing they did was to attack infrastructure. And this has nothing to do with human shields, which is the excuse for killing large numbers of people. Oh, there was a Hamas person here, we'll kill 800 or 200 or 50 people in order to kill this person. They destroyed the water purification plants. They destroyed the sewage system, the sewage plants, the sewage treatment plants. They destroyed the electrical grid. They destroyed the internet. They prevented food and water from coming in, or electricity from coming in from Israel. This led to what you see in the Gaza Strip, which is famine, which is people dying of diseases, the spread of things like polio and all kinds of other diseases. Is this genocidal? I mean, if you go back and look at what happened to the Herero and the Nakba, where maybe 100,000 people die of starvation as a result of what the German occupation of Southwest Africa does from 1904 to 1907, that's generally considered a genocide. What happens to the Armenians in 1915? And remember, the Genocide Convention is adopted in 1948. So we're taking those standards and looking backwards. But what happened, the Armenian genocide is generally, by most historians, considered a genocide. They didn't actually kill all of those people. In most cases, they starved them to death, or they let them die of thirst in the desert. They drove them from eastern Anatolia into the desert. Well, in a sense, you can argue they haven't killed all the people of Gaza. They've only killed maybe 40, 50,000, well, 42,000, and undoubtedly more under the ruins, and more will probably die in the years to come of diseases, of untreated wounds, and other things. Is that genocide? I would leave it to a lawyer. I would have no trouble calling it genocide myself. I think you have statements by Israeli leaders from Netanyahu on down, the Minister of Defense, Gallant, the Prime Minister, generals, and others, who've said things that clearly indicate genocidal intent. And you have the slaughter of so many civilians. Of the total number of people we know to be dead, over 41,000 right now, 41,700 as we speak. Overwhelming majority of these people are civilians. Now, there is a provision of international humanitarian law that for military objectives for military actions to be legal, they have to be proportional and they have to be discriminate. And those actions have not been proportional or discriminate. If you kill 100 people in order to kill a Hamas leader, this is neither proportional nor discriminate. And they've done this again and again and again and again and again. This claim of human shields is a violation of international humanitarian law. These are, at the very least, war crimes. Without any possible, I mean, there are Israeli lawyers who will defend it, and they're distorting in a grotesque manner international law, in my opinion. I'm not a lawyer, but that seems pretty clear to me.
Yeah, to what extent then, given that you just used the language proportional and discriminate, to what extent do you think that the attack last year on October 7th was justifiable? And then to what extent was the Israeli response to that initial attack justifiable?
What happened on October 7th involved attacks on civilians, which under international humanitarian law are unquestionably war crimes. You cannot attack a civilian population. You can attack a military target, but you have to do it in a way that's proportional and discriminate. Now, 1,200 Israelis, 1,140 or so, according to the last Israeli count, were killed on the 7th of October. Over 400 of them were military personnel and policemen. So 800 civilians were killed. Those are war crimes. There's no justification for those things. Those are violations of international humanitarian law. If you say that that's what Israel is doing in Gaza or in Lebanon today, you have to say that that's what happened to those civilians, that the 2/3 of the Israelis killed were civilians, completely innocent civilians, in their homes in settlements along the border, or at this party, this rave that was taking place a couple of kilometers from the border. That you can say for sure. Is it justified or unjustified? It's another issue. But these are violations of international humanitarian law. These, I think, can be adjudged war crimes, as I would adjudge the killing of Palestinian civilians, or the killing today of, I think we were up to 2,000 people being killed so far in Lebanon, of whom I'm sure the overwhelming majority are civilians. That's what the Lebanese government says. I haven't talked about the Israeli response. I mean, first of all, cutting off water and food is not, those are war crimes. There's no justification under any circumstances for doing that. The entire population of the Gaza Strip is not Hamas. The entire population of the Gaza Strip did not attack on the 7th of October. The overwhelming majority of the population of the Gaza Strip are children who have nothing to do with Hamas or politics or killing of anybody. And those are the people who are being slaughtered. Women. Hamas doesn't include any women fighters. So we're talking about people who cannot possibly be adjudged to be responsible for what happened, in addition to old people and civilians who have nothing to do with Hamas. The second thing is, people say, well, they're all Hamas. Well, actually, 43% of Palestinians, or 44%, voted for Hamas in 2006. And any opinion poll that you look at before October 7th for Gaza shows that large numbers of Gazans opposed Hamas. It was an authoritarian regime that was unpopular with apparently most Gazans, even before. So saying we can attack the civilians because they're all Hamas, these are war crimes. There's just no justification. There's no sense of proportionality. And I think that what Israel has done, moving people again and again and again, is essentially collective punishment. Whatever excuses are given, whatever pretexts are offered, whatever ludicrous human shield arguments, which of themselves are violations of international humanitarian law, there's no sense in what Israel has done is proportional. You may argue, well, the trauma inside Israel created by October 7th created a desire for retaliation. That's an explanation, but that doesn't mean it's proportional. That doesn't mean it fits within the framework of international humanitarian law.
Do you think that no matter how incommensurate with the initial attack Israel's response has been, it will succeed in eliminating Hamas if that is one of its primary objectives?
Israel has, since its creation, believed, or Israeli leaders since the creation of Israel, have believed that only force and imposing what Israel wants to impose on the Palestinians will work. Now, there are some Israeli leaders who differed with that. Rabin, Olmert, Barak. But basically, with those and a few other exceptions, Moshe Sharet earlier on in the 50s, with a few exceptions, it's force and more force. And if that doesn't work, use more force. That is in my view, suicidal policy. You cannot, in the 21st century, treat a population in that manner. They've done it. And they've succeeded because the United States has not only allowed them to do it, helped them to do it, armed them to do it. But that's not going to solve Israel's problems. So whatever they did after the 7th of October was a continuation of a policy which is intended to impose realities on the Palestinians and force them to accept things that they're not going to accept. I mean, anybody who looks at Palestinian politics, society, history is going to tell you they're still there. They're still going to resist. You have to come to terms with them some way. And that does not involve via the barrel of a gun or the bombs dropped from an F-15. So, resolving a problem caused by ethnic cleansing and caused by driving these people into the Gaza Strip and making them hate you is not going to be caused by killing 42,000 of them. You're just creating more problems. I would say the same thing about the war in Lebanon. Israel created Hezbollah. I didn't say that. Ehud Barak said that when he was defense minister. And he was right. There was no such thing as Hezbollah when Israel invaded in 1982. It was a result of the war. And Hamas is a result of occupation, of humiliation, of dispossession, and of a deprival of rights. There have been various forms Palestinian resistance has taken, armed and unarmed. Hamas represents the most extreme form. But you do this to people and you're going to get this, sooner or later, a reaction. And so you're asking me, is it proportional? Not only is it not proportional, in my view, it's not even rational. From an Israeli perspective, in terms of what I would argue they should see as their interests. I'm not talking of international humanitarian law or a Palestinian perspective.
So this is another thing that I have often heard, is that Egypt bears a lot of responsibility for what's happening in Gaza. And this is something that, I see when I look on a map that they're very close, but I'm wondering if you can explain to me what role Egypt does and does not play for what's happening in Gaza, and what burden rests with them.
Well, Egypt controlled Gaza until 1967. And you can blame them for a variety of things up to 67, when there was an Egyptian military administration of the Gaza Strip. And Egypt has controlled one of the crossings out of Gaza, the Rafah crossing, until Israel occupied it a few months ago. Today, Israel controls all access to the Gaza Strip, up until a few months ago, when Israel occupied the Rafah crossing and occupied the border of Gaza with Egypt. Egypt controlled, in part, access. Now, it didn't fully control access. Anybody who entered had to be vetted by Israeli security, electronically. So Israel actually controlled access with Egyptian assistance. And I would blame the Egyptians in part. They had their reasons, maybe. But for whatever reasons they gave and whatever reasons they may have had, they participated in the blockade of the Gaza Strip. It wasn't just an Israeli blockade. It was mainly an Israeli blockade, but it was also an Egyptian blockade. I could go into the Egyptian reasons, but that's another issue.
I would be curious to hear them.
Well, one thing that the Egyptians were worried about was the fact that they had an insurgency in Sinai, and they didn't want Palestinians to be influencing or arming or helping the insurgents in the Sinai Peninsula. And so they had reasons for wanting to control the flow of arms and people across the border between Gaza and Egyptian Sinai. There are other reasons too. One of them is their treaty with Israel, which for the Egyptian regime is very important, their peace treaty with Israel.
Are there any other major regional players that you think are playing a role in what's happening with Gaza?
Well, obviously Iran, supporter of Hamas. I would say to a lesser extent, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates. They're all in different ways involved. In the case of Qatar, they have been supporting Hamas. They were with Israeli, not just permission, the Israeli encouragement, funding the Hamas-controlled government of the Gaza Strip right up to the 7th of October. They were carrying in money in suitcases through Israeli checkpoints, or checkpoints that the Israelis monitored, with the permission of government after government after government in Jerusalem. So Qatar is involved. Saudi Arabia is also involved in a variety of ways. There are other actors today. Yemen is involved. But certainly the big ones would be Iran, Jordan to a certain extent as well.
How would you clarify or qualify exactly where we are now in this conflict today? Yeah. And let me add to that a little bit. I would like to know not only where we are in this sort of tighter saga after October 7th, but also in the 100 Years' War on Palestine.
You know, you're asking somebody who, I mean, I'm a historian. I see myself as a historian. You're asking somebody who's about where we are in the middle of a war which looks like it's expanding right now. It may or may not expand. I hope it doesn't, but it looks like it's expanding right now. How the hell am I supposed to say where we are when we could be in a completely different place tomorrow? We could be in a war in which the oil fields of the Gulf are ablaze tomorrow. We could be in a war where the United States is fighting Iran tomorrow. So to say, where are we now? Well, look like we're on the brink of a major regional conflict, but we may not be. Who knows? I mean, you know, I can help you to understand through history why we got to where we are. I can't tell you where we're going. So I don't know where we are. I know that probably this will go down as a new chapter in this war. There's no question about that. What happened on October 7th changed a lot of things, has already changed a lot of things. It was meant to change a lot of things by Hamas without their ever informing the Iranians or their other allies of what they were up to. They had their own objectives, some of which will probably never be achieved and some of which may have been achieved or may be achieved. Israel had its own objectives in its response to October 7th. One of them you mentioned, the destruction of Hamas. Hamas is a political movement that exists wherever there are Palestinians. The idea that you can destroy Hamas by some military action in the Gaza Strip is worse than absurd. It's ludicrous. It's one of the stupidest ideas I've ever heard. You can possibly defeat Hamas's military forces in the Gaza Strip, but to destroy Hamas is a political movement, a social movement, a religious movement, and it's an idea. And it exists everywhere that there are Palestinians. It's not a majority necessarily, though it's become more popular with some Palestinians and less popular with others as a result of the last year of war. Moreover, Israel has, according to what their military says, dismantled most of the main force units of Hamas's military structure in the Gaza Strip. But there's still resistance going on in the Gaza Strip. There are Israeli casualties every other day, every third or fourth or fifth day. Israel doesn't really control the Gaza Strip and controls parts of it where its troops are present, and the areas where they're not, according to what the Israeli press says, Hamas has succeeded in rebuilding its civilian infrastructure, has succeeded in rebuilding its military infrastructure. So Israel has entered into what I would say is quicksand. It's a trap, in fact. They've destroyed Hamas's main militant, all the so-called battalions and brigades. They're gone. So many of the leaders are gone. They've killed probably most of the senior commanders, but they're still resisting and they still exist. And that's not to speak of their political and other facets of Hamas. So finally, I would go to something that Henry Kissinger said. If an unconventional force can avoid complete defeat, it wins. If a conventional army doesn't achieve an absolute victory, it loses. And so Israel has entered into the Israeli military has entered into a situation where ultimately they can't really win, even in military terms, as long as resistance continues. And I mean, so far it seems to be continuing. And we see in South Lebanon, they've been bombing the living daylights out of Lebanon for days and days and days. And the Israeli army is trying to enter South Lebanon, and they're suffering a lot of casualties. So I would say the idea of destroying Hamas or destroying Hezbollah is a fantasy. Even defeating them militarily, it's not an easy proposition for a conventional army fighting an unconventional foe. Hamas fought a semi-conventional war for a bit, and as soon as they were defeated in that, they went back to guerrilla warfare. And that's what's happening today in South Lebanon. So I would say that I wouldn't be able to predict where we're going. I don't know, but where it looks like on today, what is today, the 3rd of October, I would say things look really grim for Palestinians and the Gaza Strip. I think they face a miserable future for years to come. I would say the situation of Lebanon is awful and probably going to get worse. And I think the region, I don't know where it's going to go. We could be facing a much more serious regional conflict. We already are in one. Ever since Israel started attacking Tehran and killing Palestinian leaders here and Lebanese leaders there, we went to another level of conflict, and Iran has been responding with these rockets fired on two major occasions now from Iran, not by proxies, not from Iranian militias or the Ansar Allah, the so-called Houthis in Yemen, or Hezbollah, but directly from Iran. We're in a new phase. Where it goes, I don't know.
Yeah, I suppose that this is asking you a question that you have just explained to me why you cannot answer. But it sounds to me, based on your description of Israel entering quicksand, that you don't see it as Israel having a likely and easy path to victory and this being over.
No, I agree with that. This is not over. Even if the war ends with a ceasefire tomorrow. Well, when he was leaving here, Norman said, I think there'll be a ceasefire. I don't, but I hope there will be. If there is, Israel has the problem, what do you do with Gaza? They have put forward no ideas about what to do with Gaza, at least not to the United States. There are ideas in the Israeli press which sound horrific. Some generals and politicians are saying, we empty all of northern Gaza of its population, and if anybody stays, we starve them to death, and we treat it as a free fire zone. Well, that doesn't sound like a very good idea to me.
Does it seem unlikely, though?
It's possible. I mean, the way things are going, given the complete complacence and support of the United States for whatever Israel ends up deciding to do, I see no restraint on Israel. They don't seem to understand that the entire world sees what's happening and finds it horrific and detestable and despicable and has turned against Israel. The entire world, including in public opinion in most Western countries. Public opinion in this country months ago opposed the Biden administration's policy. Public opinion months ago in the United States opposed Israel's war on Gaza before it spread to Lebanon, as it has now. And public opinion opposed sending weapons, majorities, to Israel. That's American public opinion, which has been subjected to decades of generations of an exclusively Israeli narrative. And they've already seen through the fog of propaganda and lies and the anguish that was caused by the 7th of October in Israel and among many people in the United States, they've suddenly seen what's happened since is really bad and should not continue. Now, the governments of Western countries are continuing to support Israel. Our elites in our universities and corporations and media continue to support Israel. So there's not going to be a change as far as I can tell. But Israel has lost public opinion the world over and in the West. And that the West is the metropole of this project. I mean, Israel is a thriving entity. It's a nation state. It's a regional nuclear superpower, yada, yada, yada. All of that's true. But it's entirely dependent on the United States and Western Europe for certain things. Its major trading partner is Europe, the EU. The United States supplies it with its weapons. You don't have American and European support, you can't do what you're doing. And they're threatening the very basis of that support by basically thumbing their nose at public opinion the world over. You see the way that Israeli leaders treat the United Nations. Well, the United Nations represents public opinion in the world. So I would say, not only do I not see this as coming out well for them in terms of the specifics of Gaza or the specifics of Lebanon, I would say that globally, Israel's put itself in a terrible, terrible position. Had they accepted a ceasefire the ceasefire Biden offered months ago, had they accepted the ceasefire that Biden suggested for Lebanon weeks ago, they would be in a marginally better position today. Were they to accept one tomorrow, they would be in a marginally better position. But it does not seem that that's the way things are going. I don't know. I'm not predicting the future, but the way things have gone up to now make me think that they won't take that offering.
The issue, though, also seems to be that despite Israel not having public opinion, perhaps this imposes like a very hard stop on what they are able or not able to do. So, for instance, when I asked Benny Morris about genocide, he said, well, they would just use a nuclear bomb if they wanted to commit genocide or something to this effect. But it isn't stopped.
He doesn't know anything about historical genocides if he says that. I mean, everybody now considers what was done in Southwest Africa with bayonets and guns and starving people genocide. You don't need a nuclear bomb to commit genocide. The Ottoman army didn't have, and the Teshkilat Makhsusa and the militia, the Kurdish militias that killed all these people, didn't have nuclear bombs. In fact, most of the people were killed by starving them to death and depriving them of water. So that's a ludicrous assertion. I'm sorry, I don't mean to argue with Benny Morris.
Right. My point, though, was just that public opinion has always been, it seems, against Israel. And maybe not in the immediate aftermath of October 7th.
Certainly not in the immediate aftermath. There was
Right.
global sympathy for Israel.
Right. But
It's Israel's actions after the 7th of October that changed that. It's not some visceral anti-Semitism in the world. It's what Israel was seen to be doing by people who didn't take in the propaganda that you find in the mainstream media that caused that reaction on the part of public opinion.
right, I'm just saying, though, that this lack of public support has not really stopped them from doing much that I can tell.
No, you're right. Not at all. It's had no impact whatsoever.
So I guess you said you don't know what to say will happen from here. But the last thing I'll ask then is what you hope will happen.
Oh, that's right now, the situation looks pretty grim. I mean, it's hard to find hope anywhere in what I'm seeing. I hope that Israel will get over this rage that has consumed Israeli public opinion, and many of their supporters, as a consequence of October 7th, will come to their senses and will realize they can't solve this problem with force, that this problem is unsolvable with force. In fact, force exacerbates it. It's essential that they understand that. It's essential also that they do something that's going to be extremely hard for them, which is to relieve themselves of this victim complex. Israel is not the victim in this. Israelis were victims on the 7th of October. 800 civilians were victims. There's no question. But in a situation where Israel has been oppressing and kicking out and occupying the Palestinians for 75 years, Israel is not the victim. The Palestinians are the victim. They have to get over that idea that because the history of the Jewish people involves century after century and century after of victimization, that a victimizer cannot, that a historical victim cannot be a victimizer. They have to overcome that. That's a real problem. Because if you assume, because we're victims, historic victims, nothing we do can be criticized, you're going to have a problem. And they do have a problem. It's not just the rage and the anger and the pain and the trauma of October 7th. This is rooted in a deeper issue where they cannot come to grips with the fact that what they have done to the Palestinians has caused the problem that they face today. And that unless they recognize that and deal with that and say, well, we won't deal with it with force, we'll figure out some way that these two peoples can live together. And that involves a third thing that they're going to have to do. There is going to have to be a recognition that there are two peoples here. Now, a lot of Palestinians don't accept that, but a whole lot of Israelis don't accept that. And in the case of Israel, that is part of the Israeli constitution. As of 2018, the Israel Nation State of the Jewish People law, and as a result of a variety of other things that this government has done, they argue there's only one people here. Only the Jewish people have the right of national self-determination in the land of Israel by Israeli law, by a basic law that has constitutional force. Well, if you say that, there's no middle ground. We will ground you out. We will destroy you because you don't exist. You don't have a right to exist. That's not just some far-right lunatic Israeli politician. That is a basic law passed by an overwhelming majority of the Israeli Knesset in 2018. They're going to have to get over that. Now, Palestinians have to get over a lot of stuff too. A lot of changes have to happen among Palestinians. If you talk about the rage and the anger and the trauma that drives Israelis, you can only imagine with 1,200, 1,140, whatever the number is, dead on the 7th of October, you can only imagine the rage and the pain in a situation where 42,000 Palestinians have been killed. So both sides have to get over those things and have to come to an understanding that somehow or other there are two peoples here, and they have to figure out how they're going to live in this single land. And it cannot be by the supremacy of one people over another, which is what Zionism argues for. It doesn't argue for an Arab-Jewish state. It doesn't argue for a shared democratic state. It argues for a Jewish state in a majority Arab country. You can't do that. It's not, you could have done it in 1800 or 1700. You can't do that in 2024. And they have to come to terms with that. That's not an easy thing. The desire for a Jewish state has now been, deeply ingrained in people's minds for generations, since the rise of Hitler, or almost 100 years, 90 years, 80 years, whatever it is. And that would have been fine. I mean, you go back to Rashid Khalidi's letter to Herzl in 1899. He has no problem with Zionism per se, with the idea of Jewish peoplehood per se. He says, but don't do it here, because there's another people here. And that blindness to that, you read Herzl's response and you can see he doesn't see that, he doesn't hear that. That blindness to that reality that you're trying to create a national entity in a place that already has a people is part of the problem. They have to overcome that. If they were able to move in that direction, that would give me hope.
Well, Rashid, I really sincerely hope that your most dire predictions do not
I haven't
come
predicted
true.
anything.
You haven't predicted, but you've given some possibilities. I really hope they don't come true. But this is a very important time to be having this conversation. So I'm incredibly thankful to you for taking the time to sit down and have it with me.
You're very welcome. Thanks for doing it.